The shriek sliced through the placid afternoon quiet of Maple Creek, a blade of pure panic that made birds scatter from the ancient oak in the town square. He took them. They're gone. My jewelry. The voice belonged to Chloe, a teenager whose perpetual pout was a fixture of the local scenery. She stood on the sidewalk, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at the old man tending his small patch of garden in front of a modest, weathered bungalow. Arthur Finch didn't look up immediately. His gnarled hands, stained with the dark, rich soil he so carefully cultivated, continued to gently pack earth around the base of a struggling rose bush. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who had learned patience through loss. The accusation, however, hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Heads began to turn. Windows slid open. The drowsy rhythm of the town stuttered to a halt. Arthur finally straightened his back, a slow, painful process that spoke of old injuries and long years. His eyes, the pale blue of a winter sky, found the girl. They held no malice, no defensiveness, only a deep, abiding weariness. He was a ghost in this town, a fixture as unremarkable as a crack in the pavement, until this moment. Now he was the center of a storm. A luxury sedan screeched to a halt beside Chloe, and a man in a tailored suit, Braden, her father, burst out. He was a developer who had been buying up properties on the outskirts of town, a man whose ambition was as loud as his car. He wrapped an arm around his sobbing daughter without looking at her, his gaze fixed on Arthur like a predator sizing up prey. "You," Braden snarled, his voice a low growl that carried across the street. "What did you do?" Arthur's silence was his only reply. He stood beside his roses, a silent sentinel in a faded work shirt and worn trousers. The scent of loam and crushed marigolds clung to him, a stark contrast to the expensive cologne radiating from Braden. The community watched. Mrs. Gable peered through her lace curtains, her hand covering her mouth. Two teenagers on skateboards slowed, their wheels whispering on the asphalt as they stared. The mailman, Tom, paused mid-stride, his bag suddenly feeling heavier. They saw a distraught, wealthy girl and her powerful father, and they saw Arthur Finch, the quiet widower, the man who kept to himself, the veteran nobody spoke to. The equation was simple, its solution foregone. In their eyes, the verdict was already delivered. Arthur felt the weight of their judgment, a familiar pressure that had settled on his shoulders the day he'd returned from a war no one wanted to remember, a weight that had doubled the day he buried his wife, Eleanor. He was being dismissed again, erased by the assumptions of others. He looked from Braden's furious face to Chloe's theatrical tears, and then at the silent, watching houses. He was alone, a scarecrow in a field of suspicion, and the first crows were beginning to land. Braden stalked across the street, his polished leather shoes leaving faint impressions in the soft grass of the verge. He stopped just short of Arthur's meticulously edged garden, a space no bigger than a family car, but vibrant with life. "I asked you a question, old man." Braden's voice was laced with contempt, each word a little shove. "My daughter says you were lurking around her, and now her necklace and bracelet are gone. Family heirloom. You're going to empty your pockets." Right now, Arthur's gaze drifted past Braden to the rose bush. It had been Eleanor's favorite, a delicate variety called Peace. He had spent 3 years coaxing it back from the brink after a harsh winter. He could almost feel her presence in the warmth of the sun on his neck, hear her gentle chiding about fussing too much. Her memory was the only heirloom he cared about. "I have nothing that belongs to your daughter," Arthur said. His voice was raspy from disuse, but steady. It held no tremor of fear, only a profound exhaustion. This quiet dignity seemed to enrage Braden further. "Don't play games with me," he snapped, taking a step closer, invading Arthur's personal space. "People like you think you can just take what you want. You see a nice girl, expensive jewelry. It's simple math for a bottom feeder." He gestured vaguely at Arthur's small house, the paint peeling in long strips like sunburnt skin. "Look at this place. You're pathetic. Probably need the money for cheap booze." The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that crept up Arthur's neck. He had faced down enemy fire in jungles thick with unseen dangers. He had held dying men in his arms. He had stared into the abyss and it had stared back. But this casual, public cruelty felt different. It was a dismissal of his entire existence, a reduction of his life to a caricature of poverty and desperation. Chloe, seeing her father taking control, amplified her sobs. "It was a gift from my grandmother, Daddy. It was priceless," she wailed, clutching her bare neck. The community's silence solidified into a wall of consensus. They saw Braden's wealth and his anger, and they interpreted it as righteous indignation. They saw Arthur's shabby clothes and his silence, and they interpreted it as guilt. No one stepped forward. No one offered a word in his defense. They were spectators at a public shaming, and their non-participation was a form of consent. Braden jabbed a finger toward Arthur's chest. "Sheriff's on his way. You can either give the jewelry back now, and I'll consider not pressing charges, or you can spend the night in a cell and we'll see how tough you are then." The threat was clear. It wasn't just about the jewelry anymore. It was about power. It was about a man like Braden putting a man like Arthur in his place. Arthur's hands, still caked with soil, curled into loose fists at his sides. He could feel the familiar, dangerous heat rising from his gut, the combat-honed instinct to meet aggression with overwhelming force. But he held it down, burying it deep, just as he had buried so many other things. Eleanor wouldn't have wanted that. "Dignity," she used to say, "is the armor you wear when you have nothing else left." Arthur's life was a collection of quiet rituals. He woke before the sun, when the world was still washed in shades of gray and blue. He'd make a single cup of black coffee and sit on his back porch, watching the light spill over the distant hills. This was the time he felt closest to Eleanor. He could almost imagine her beside him, her hand resting on his, her presence a warm, comforting weight. They had bought this little house together, a fixer-upper that she had filled with light and laughter. She had planned the garden, sketching out the plots on a napkin one evening, her eyes sparkling with dreams of color and life. "It'll be our sanctuary, Art," she'd said. "A place where things grow. A place to remind us that life goes on." After the war, he had struggled. The world he came back to was not the one he had left. The heroism his country had demanded of him was met with suspicion and scorn. He was adrift, a man trained for a world of clear-cut enemies, now lost in a landscape of moral ambiguity. Eleanor had been his anchor. She saw past the haunted look in his eyes, past the silence and the nightmares. She saw the honorable man she had married. She had grounded him, loved him, and slowly, painstakingly, brought him back to himself. When she got sick, the world had tilted on its axis again. The battle was different this time. It was quiet, insidious, fought in sterile hospital rooms that smelled of antiseptic and fear. He was by her side for every treatment, every false dawn of hope, every crushing setback. He held her hand until the very end, her last whispered words a plea. "Promise me, Art. Promise you'll finish the garden. Don't let the weeds win." So the garden became his mission. It was more than dirt and flowers. It was a promise. It was his last conversation with his wife. Each seed he planted was a word, each bloom a memory. The roses were her laughter, the sturdy lavender her resilience, the humble marigolds her quiet strength. Tending to it was his therapy, his penance, his prayer. He poured what little he had, his meager disability pension, into it. He bought the best soil, the hardiest seeds. It was his sole connection to a life that had been stolen from him, a testament to a love that endured beyond the grave. This was the man Braden saw as a bottom feeder, a man whose net worth wasn't measured in stocks and real estate, but in the currency of loyalty, love, and a single, sacred promise. He didn't have family heirlooms made of gold and diamonds. His heirloom was a patch of earth, vibrant and alive, a living memorial to the woman who had been his entire world. The idea of a stranger's hands, a sheriff's or anyone else's, searching his home, desecrating the sanctuary he and Eleanor had built, was unthinkable. It would be a violation far worse than a night in a cell. It would be a trespass on sacred ground. The pressure mounted as a police cruiser turned the corner, its lights not flashing, but its presence amplifying the tension tenfold. Sheriff Brody, a man whose gut hung over his belt, lumbered out of the car. He and Arthur had a passing acquaintance built on nods and grunts exchanged at the local hardware store. Brody's face was a mask of professional neutrality, but his eyes darted from Braden's expensive suit to Arthur's dirt-stained hands. The calculus was happening all over again. "Braden, what's the situation here?" Brody asked, his voice a tired drawl. "This vagrant harassed my daughter and stole her jewelry," Braden said, his tone suggesting the matter was already closed. "I want him searched, and I want his hovel tossed. The jewelry is in there. I guarantee it." The word hovel hung in the air, another casual barb designed to strip Arthur of his humanity. Arthur saw the flicker of indecision in Brody's eyes. The sheriff knew Arthur wasn't a troublemaker, but Braden was influential. He was bringing money into a town that desperately needed it. A complaint from Braden meant paperwork, phone calls from the mayor, a headache Brody didn't want. "Arthur," Brody said, his voice softening slightly, a sign of his internal conflict. "You mind if we just take a look? We can clear this all up real quick." It wasn't a question. It was a directive wrapped in the guise of politeness. The community, now a small crowd gathered on the opposite sidewalk, leaned in. They were no longer just watching. They were a jury, waiting for the proceedings to unfold. Their silence was a heavy blanket, smothering any possibility of grace or understanding. Arthur's gaze fell upon his front door. Behind it was a lifetime of memories. Eleanor's favorite armchair, still holding the faint impression of her form. A framed photo on the mantelpiece of them on their wedding day, young and full of impossible hope. Her collection of porcelain birds on the windowsill. The thought of Braden's self-righteous anger and Brody's reluctant duty trampling through that space, touching those things, casting shadows on his memories, was a physical pain. This was the final escalation. It was no longer just his word against a girl's lie. It was his entire life, his private sanctuary, about to be invaded and judged by a world that had already condemned him. Braden, sensing victory, crossed his arms. "Let's get on with it. I don't have all day." But then he looked at the garden, a sneer twisting his lips. "Or, we could save everyone the trouble. Maybe if a certain somebody's little flower patch got accidentally trampled during the search, he might be more inclined to remember where he put my daughter's property." The threat was vile and direct. It wasn't about the jewelry. It was about breaking him. It was about destroying the one thing he had left. Arthur looked at the peace rose, its petals a delicate blend of cream and pale yellow. He looked at the silent, watching faces of his neighbors. He felt the last vestiges of his hope for fairness crumble into dust. He was cornered. The world had given him no honorable way out, so he would have to make one. A profound stillness settled over Arthur. The internal battle, the flicker of rage, the crushing weight of humiliation. It all receded, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. He had faced impossible choices before. He knew that sometimes the only way to win was to choose the terms of your surrender. He would not allow them to defile his home. He would not allow them to trample Eleanor's roses. He would protect her memory, even if it cost him everything else. He ignored Braden, his eyes locking with Sheriff Brody's. "There's no need to search my house," Arthur said, his voice quiet but resonant, cutting through the tension. "The girl is upset. She should have her jewelry back," Braden scoffed. "So you admit it. Where is it?" Arthur's gaze didn't waver from the sheriff's. "I don't have it, but I will replace it." The statement was so unexpected it caused a ripple of confusion through the crowd. Brody blinked, nonplussed. Braden's face contorted in a mask of disbelief. "Replace it? That was a custom piece, you old fool. It's worth thousands. You couldn't afford the clasp on it." Arthur turned his back on them all and walked with a steady, determined gait toward his front door. He disappeared inside, leaving a wake of baffled silence. The crowd murmured. What was he doing? Getting a weapon? Hiding? After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he reappeared. In his hand was a thin, worn manila envelope. He walked back across his small lawn, past the roses, and stopped in front of Sheriff Brody. He didn't look at Braden or Chloe. He held out the envelope. "This is all I have," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "It's my savings. For my property taxes. For emergencies." He paused, the words catching in his throat for just a second. "It should be enough. Buy her a new necklace." He placed the envelope into Brody's stunned hand. It was a gesture of profound sacrifice. It was not an admission of guilt, but an act of defiance. He was paying to protect his dignity, to shield his memories from the grubby hands of the world. He was giving them his money, but he was keeping what was truly valuable. Inside the envelope was just over $5,000, painstakingly saved over years, a thin buffer between him and utter destitution. It was the cost of a new roof, the price of a harsh winter, the sum of his earthly security. And he was giving it away to end a lie. Braden, for the first time, looked momentarily speechless. This was not the outcome he had expected. He had wanted submission, a confession, the satisfaction of breaking the old man. Instead, Arthur had robbed him of his victory, transforming an act of humiliation into one of inexplicable, towering grace. Brody held the envelope as if it were a burning coal. He looked at Arthur's face, at the deep lines etched by grief and hardship, and for the first time, he saw not a suspect, but a man of immense, quiet strength. He saw the sacrifice, and he felt a profound sense of shame. Arthur turned, without another word, and walked back to his garden. He knelt, his knees protesting, and picked up his small trowel. His hands, now trembling slightly, resumed their work, packing the soil around the base of the peace rose. He had lost his money, but he had saved his sanctuary. It was a devastating trade, and the quiet, rhythmic patting of soil against root was the only sound he could make to keep from shattering. The act, so quiet and yet so monumental, hung in the air long after Arthur had turned his back. The transfer of the envelope was a silent thunderclap that shook the foundations of the crowd's assumptions. Sheriff Brody stood frozen, the thin packet of money feeling impossibly heavy in his hand. He looked down at it, then at Braden, whose face was a mixture of confusion and thwarted rage. The developer had won, but it felt like a hollow, bitter victory. Chloe had stopped her performative crying, her eyes wide as she watched the old man kneeling in the dirt, his back to them all. A flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, crossed her face before she quickly suppressed it. The whispers started then, quiet as rustling leaves. "He just gave him the money?" Mrs. Gable murmured from behind her curtain to her husband. "All of it? Just like that?" On the sidewalk, one of the skateboarders said to his friend, "Dude, that was weird." The old guy didn't even fight. His friend nodded, his eyes fixed on Arthur. "He just paid him to go away." Tom, the mailman, finally continued on his route, but he kept glancing back, a deep furrow in his brow. He'd delivered mail to Arthur for a decade. He knew about the disability checks. He knew the man lived frugally. He knew what that envelope represented. At the local diner, where Sheriff Brody went for coffee half an hour later, the story had already arrived, carried on the wings of gossip. The waitress, a young woman named Sarah, poured Brody's coffee, her movements stiff. "Heard what happened over at the Finch place," she said, her voice low. "It's not right, Sheriff. That old man comes in here sometimes. He only ever orders black coffee. Sits for an hour. Never bothers a soul. He's not a thief," Brody just grunted, staring into his cup. The shame he'd felt on the lawn was now settling into a hard knot in his stomach. He'd been a pawn in Braden's petty power play, and he'd allowed an honorable man to be stripped of his last dollar. The shift was happening across town, in small pockets of conversation. At the hardware store, the owner mentioned how Arthur always paid in cash, counting out his coins carefully. At the library, the librarian recalled how he gently taped a torn page in a book on horticulture before returning it. These were small, insignificant details before. Now they were pieces of a puzzle, forming a picture of a man who was the opposite of the one Braden had painted. The most significant shift happened in a dusty, cluttered pawn shop on the edge of town. The owner, a grizzled man named Henderson, had been watching the commotion from his doorway. Later that afternoon, Braden swaggered in, a triumphant smirk on his face, and tossed a gold-colored necklace and bracelet onto the counter. "Tell me what this junk is worth," he'd said, wanting to quantify his victory. Henderson picked up the pieces. He felt the lack of weight, saw the cheap clasp, the telltale discoloration on the back. He looked at Braden, then thought of the old man kneeling in his garden. "It's plated," Henderson said, his voice flat. "Costume jewelry. Maybe $20 for the set. If you're lucky." Braden's smirk vanished. Henderson pushed the jewelry back across the counter. "What that old man did today, that was worth a hell of a lot more." The truth had begun its slow, inexorable crawl into the light. The community's judgment was beginning to curdle into collective guilt. They had watched a good man be crucified, and they had done nothing. They had mistaken quietness for weakness, and poverty for a lack of character. The image of Arthur, alone in his garden, tending his roses after sacrificing everything, was now burned into the town's conscience. The sound began as a distant, low growl, almost imperceptible beneath the chirping of crickets in the late afternoon. It was a vibration felt more than heard, a tremor in the asphalt. Then it grew. It became a rumble, then a roar, a throbbing, guttural chorus that seemed to shake the very air. Heads turned. People came out onto their porches, their faces etched with alarm. The sound was unfamiliar, aggressive, an invading force. Down the main street of Maple Creek they came, a river of chrome and black leather. One motorcycle became 5, then 10, then 20. They moved with a disciplined, intimidating precision, not a chaotic gang, but an army. Sunlight glinted off polished engines and spiked helmets. The bikes were massive, Harleys mostly, their engines popping and snarling as they downshifted, the sound echoing off the quaint storefronts. On the back of their leather vests or cuts was a patch that struck a primal fear into most: the Death's Head logo of the Hells Angels. The procession didn't roar through town. It rolled in, slow and deliberate, a predator asserting its dominance over a new territory. They flowed onto Arthur Street and came to a stop, forming a formidable semicircular wall of steel and leather around his small property. The engines were cut, one by one, a staggered silencing that was somehow more menacing than the noise. In the ensuing quiet, the only sounds were the ticking of cooling metal and the nervous swallows of the onlookers. A man dismounted from the lead bike. He was built like a mountain, with a long, graying beard braided into 2 sections. His face was a roadmap of hard living, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never lost a fight. This was Silas, the chapter president. He took off his sunglasses, his gaze sweeping over the silent houses, the curtain-twitching neighbors, before settling on the small figure still kneeling in the garden. Arthur had heard them coming. The sound was as familiar to him as a lullaby, a visceral memory from another life. He slowly got to his feet, his body aching, and turned to face them. He showed no fear, only a flicker of recognition. Silas walked to the edge of the garden, his heavy boots stopping just short of the flowers. The other bikers remained by their machines, silent, watchful, a phalanx of guardians. "Finch," Silas said, his voice a low baritone rumble. It wasn't a question. Arthur simply nodded. Silas, the 2 men stood there for a long moment, the space between them charged with unspoken history. The town watched, utterly bewildered. What possible connection could there be between this quiet, broken old man and the most notorious motorcycle club in the world? Silas's eyes took in the scene. The pristine garden, the shabby house, the exhaustion etched onto Arthur's face. His gaze was searching, assessing. "Heard there was some trouble." Arthur gave a slight, weary shrug. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Silas's lips twitched into something that might have been a smile. "That's what Deacon used to say." The name hung in the air. Silas looked over at the peace rose. "Heard you were building a garden." Arthur's expression softened. a deep sadness welling in his eyes. A promise, Silas nodded, a gesture of profound understanding. He turned his head slightly, speaking to the biker closest to him without raising his voice. T-Bone, go find a man named Braden. He has something that belongs to our friend T-Bone. A man whose neck was as thick as a tree trunk simply nodded and swung a leg back over his bike. The engine roared to life with a single explosive kick, shattering the silence. He pulled away from the curb, his destination clear. The Brotherhood had arrived. They were not here to cause chaos. They were here to balance a scale, to honor a debt. And for the first time all day, a fragile, unfamiliar sense of hope began to bloom in Arthur's chest, right alongside Eleanor's roses. The arrival of T-Bone at Braden's newly acquired office building was not subtle. The Harley pulled up directly on the manicured lawn, its tires leaving deep tracks in the sod that Braden had paid a fortune to have laid just a week prior. T-Bone didn't bother with the door. He walked straight through the plate glass entrance, shattering it into 1,000 pieces, and stepped into the pristine lobby. The receptionist screamed. Braden, hearing the commotion from his corner office, came storming out, his face puce with rage. What in God's name do you think you're? His words died in his throat when he saw T-Bone. The biker was a wall of muscle and menace, methodically pulling off his leather gloves as he advanced. You're Braden, T-Bone stated. We need to talk about some money you accidentally acquired back on Arthur Street. The truth was being laid bare. As Silas stood guard by the garden, Sheriff Brody, who had been watching from his cruiser down the street, finally found the courage to approach. He held out the manila envelope. Silas, Arthur, I think this belongs to you, Brody stammered. Silas didn't take it. He just looked at Brody, his eyes cold. You stood by, the 3 words were a heavier condemnation than any threat. At that moment, Henderson, the pawn shop owner, came hurrying down the street, clutching the cheap, gold-plated jewelry. Sheriff, Silas, he called out, breathless. I have to show you something. He held out the necklace and bracelet. This is what the girl claimed was a priceless heirloom. It's fake. Worthless. He looked at Arthur with deep regret in his eyes. I'm sorry, Mr. Finch. I should have spoken up sooner. The final piece of the puzzle was delivered by Silas himself. He turned his attention from the gawking neighbors to Arthur, his voice loud enough for all to hear. Some of you might wonder why we're here, he began, his voice commanding absolute silence. You see a quiet old man. We see a hero. He pointed a thick finger at Arthur. This man, Sergeant Arthur Finch, was a forward observer in a war you've all tried to forget. He was in a place called the Ashau Valley. My brother, not by blood but by choice, a man we called Deacon, was pinned down. His platoon was being overrun. Silas's voice grew thick with emotion. Deacon was on the radio calling in an airstrike on his own position. It was his only option. But Arthur was watching. He saw a path, a chance no one else saw. Against orders, he left his position, laid down suppressive fire, and dragged Deacon and 2 other wounded men to safety. Just moments before the whole hillside was turned to fire and ash, the crowd was stunned into absolute silence. Mrs. Gable's hand flew to her mouth again, this time in awe. Tom the mailman shook his head slowly, looking at Arthur with new eyes. Deacon owed his life to this man, Silas continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. And Deacon was our brother, which makes Arthur our family. A debt of honor is the only kind of debt we take seriously. Deacon passed a few years back. Cancer. But before he died, he made us all promise. He said, if you ever find Sergeant Finch, you tell him Deacon never forgot. And you watch his back. Just then, T-Bone's Harley rumbled back down the street. He pulled up, dismounted, and walked over to Silas. He was holding a thick wad of cash, far more than what was in Arthur's envelope. He also held a car key. Braden was very cooperative, T-Bone said, a grim smile playing on his lips. He offered a sincere apology and a donation to the Don't Trample Flowers Fund. The keys are to his sedan. A down payment on the new glass for his office. Silas took the cash and handed Arthur's original envelope back to him. Then he walked over to Braden's car, which was still parked by the curb. He opened the passenger door, tossed the keys on the seat, and left it there. A silent public offering to anyone who might need it. The humiliation was now complete, but its target had been reversed. The truth, delivered with the force of a roaring engine, had not just set Arthur free, it had elevated him. The recognition was swift and total. The biker's actions had held up a mirror to the town, and the reflection was not flattering. The shame that had been simmering now boiled over into a palpable need for atonement. Silas took the thick roll of cash from T-Bone and walked over to Arthur, holding it out. Arthur shook his head. "I don't want his money," Silas nodded, as if expecting this. "I know. This isn't for you. It's for the town." He turned to the stunned crowd. "This money will go to repairing things. Things this town has let fall apart. Starting here." He gestured to the peeling paint on Arthur's house and the rickety fence that bordered his property. "The rest can go to the Veterans Fund. Maybe buy some flags for the graves nobody visits anymore." He then walked back to his bike and retrieved a folded black leather vest. It was a brand new cut, devoid of patches except for one. On the front, over the heart, was a simple, stark white patch that read, "Deacon's Keeper." On the back, below the club's death's head, was a single rocker that said, "Honorary." Silas approached Arthur, holding the vest with a reverence usually reserved for a sacred object. "This is from all of us," he said, his voice softer now. "It's not a membership. It's a statement. It means you're under our protection. It means no one ever lays a hand on you or this place again. It means your family." Arthur looked at the vest, his eyes welling up for the first time that day. He reached out a trembling, soil-stained hand and touched the leather. It was more than a gift. It was a restoration. It was the belonging he had been denied for decades, the respect he had earned in a far-off jungle but had never received at home. He didn't put it on. Instead, he simply held it, his head bowed. The bikers didn't wait for a thank you. They began to move with quiet purpose. Two of them started unloading tools and lumber from a chase truck that had pulled up. They began methodically tearing down the old, rotted fence. Others produced buckets and scrapers and began prepping the side of the house for a new coat of paint. The community, shaken from its stupor, began to act. Mr. Henderson from the pawn shop walked over, his face etched with remorse. "I've got paint, Mr. Finch. Any color you want." On the house, Mrs. Gable appeared with a tray of iced tea and sandwiches. "You men must be thirsty," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The two skateboarders, who had been watching the whole time, walked up to one of the bikers. Can we help?" one asked timidly. The biker looked him up and down, then handed him a pry bar. "Start on that end of the fence, kid. Pull the nails." Sheriff Brody, his face red with shame, directed traffic away from the street. Even the mayor made an appearance, stammering an apology to Arthur and offering city resources, which Silas politely but firmly declined. "This is a family matter," he said. The transformation was breathtaking. The street that had been a stage for humiliation was now a bustling hub of communal restoration. The silence of judgment had been replaced by the sounds of hammers, saws, and quiet, respectful conversation. Arthur stood in the middle of it all, clutching the leather vest, watching as his fence was rebuilt, stronger than before, by the unlikeliest of angels. They weren't just fixing his house. They were mending the torn fabric of his life, and in doing so, they were helping a broken town mend itself. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street and bathing the scene in a warm, golden light. The work was almost done. A new, sturdy white picket fence stood in place of the old, rotted one, its lines crisp and clean. The side of Arthur's house now wore a fresh coat of pale yellow paint, the color of daffodils in spring, a color Eleanor would have loved. The bikers worked with a quiet, efficient camaraderie, their movements economical and precise. They cleaned up every scrap of wood, every stray nail. They left the place better than they had found it, a core tenet of their unwritten code when dealing with their own. Throughout it all, Arthur sat on his front porch steps, the leather vest resting in his lap. He watched them, a silent observer of his own redemption. He saw the way the townspeople, who had once shunned him, now worked alongside the intimidating bikers. He saw Mrs. Gable refilling glasses, her husband helping to carry away old lumber. He saw the teenagers working up a sweat, a newfound sense of purpose in their movements. Braden's car was gone. Someone at some point had quietly claimed it. Chloe and her father were nowhere to be seen, having vanished from the town's narrative as quickly as they had entered it. They were a bad memory already fading. As the last of the tools were being packed away, Silas approached Arthur's porch. He sat on the step below him, the two men looking out at the transformed street. "Deacon told me about your wife," Silas said quietly. "He said you talked about her garden all the time. Said it was the only thing that made you smile over there." Arthur nodded, tracing the stitching on the deacon's keeper patch with his finger. "She was everything." "I know," Silas said. "We all have an Eleanor. Something we fight for. Something we promise to protect." He stood up, his knees cracking. "We'll be heading out, but we're never far. You have our numbers. You see so much as a shadow you don't like, you call one by one." The bikers finished their tasks and walked back to their machines. They mounted up, the leather creaking, the metal gleaming in the twilight. There was no fanfare, no loud goodbyes, just a series of quiet nods in Arthur's direction. A gesture of profound, unspoken respect. Arthur stood up and walked to his new fence gate. He didn't put on the vest. Instead, he carefully draped it over the gatepost, the black leather a stark, powerful symbol against the white wood. It was a flag, a shield, a declaration. Silas was the last to mount his bike. He looked at Arthur, at the vest on the post, and at the garden, safe and untouched behind its new barrier. He gave a single, sharp nod, a sign of a mission completed. Then he kicked his engine to life. The roar was deafening, but this time it wasn't a threat. It was a salute. One by one, the other engines joined in, a thunderous chorus that rolled through the quiet streets of Maple Creek. It was the sound of loyalty, of a debt paid, of a promise kept. The river of chrome and leather pulled away, their taillights shrinking into red pinpricks in the gathering dark. They left behind a quiet street, a repaired home, and a community forever changed. Arthur stood by his gate long after they were gone, listening until the last rumble faded into silence. He looked at the vest, a tangible piece of a brotherhood he never knew he had. He looked at his garden, his sanctuary, now secure. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the peace rose, and for the first time in a very long time, Arthur Finch felt a sense of peace settle over his own weary soul. He was no longer a ghost. He was home.